Well, good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Condo Solutions, Monday mornings from 9 to 10 o'clock. We talk about things that go on in your condo or HOA, or maybe your neighbor's condo or HOA. So we're talking about issues that may affect you, and it's a community service program. So write down the number, because we would encourage you to call if you've got a question or want to answer about something that's happening. 220-9788 is the number in the studio. That's 220-9788 or 220-WSTU. That's how you can reach us. Put the number aside, because that's the number that you can reach a lot of the shows here at WSTU, because a lot of them encourage you to call in, and you're welcome to call. But our show in particular, we're here to answer your questions. My name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a local CPA and a community association manager, and have been doing auditing and tax work in the Sierra industry for some number of years now. And we have, we also have Peter Mullengarden. Peter's our attorney, and Peter has been dealing in this industry forever and ever, and has been working with clients, primarily associations, although back a number of years ago, when he was younger and not as wise, he served the time on the dark side, working for the developer side of the business for a while, sort of. And so he's reformed now, and so he's back here. He's been doing this for 35 years or so we pretty much can trust him, although I do understand that Mueller has opened an investigation on him, but I don't know. Something about collusion among associations. But anyway, no, Peter Mullengarden, he's our attorney. He's the guy you listen to the show for. And he answers our questions, helps us solve some of our problems, and he's been doing that with us for now 16 years or so here on the show. So, again, feel free to call, and we always encourage you to call, because there are always people out there that have a similar problem, and they're just too shy to call on the radio. They think we have thousands of listeners. We have 5, so don't worry about it. Nobody's going to hear you. But you don't have to give us your real name. You don't have to give us your association. In fact, we don't want your association, because it may cause somebody else to not pay attention, because they think it doesn't apply to them. So, but we do. We encourage you to call. We're here to help you, answer your questions, and we will do the best we can. We always remind you that we don't have your documents, so that can make a huge difference, and therefore we cannot give you a solid 100%, this is the answer and the only answer, because we don't have those documents. So if you've got a situation like that where you've got to have the answer, then you need to contact Peter, and he'll help you with that and he'll be able to look at your documents and help you out. But in the interim, for our purposes, we'll do the best we can based on what you tell us your documents say, based on what we know the law is, what we know the rules and regulations are at the state level, and what the typical procedures are. And we also will generally talk about an issue a little broader than maybe your specific question, because we do want to hit something that might not be exactly the same, but close enough. So that's why we may broaden our discussion, even though it might not specifically apply to your situation. So that's the story, and we're sticking to it. 220-9788, 220-WSTU, and give us a call if you've got something that's bothering you, or you want to ask about something about what's going on with your association, or some questions you've had. So Peter, I guess that we were talking a little bit about some issues, contract stuff last week, things that people should be aware of. And that's, I think, good to be looking at as we're going into the true season, which is hurricane season, and as we're starting to make some changes and improvements and that type of thing. I know there's a lot of, when we talk about associations, common property, things like that, these are also homes, and particularly in HOA situations, but even in the condos, there's the tendency for the people to want to spruce up their property. And, they may want to fix up their patio, maybe put a little tile down. They might want to do something different with their windows or their doors. Maybe do some hurricane glass, or some shutters, things like that, and also even maybe changing the utilities. Maybe they're wanting to do something with different types of utilities, maybe dish TV or dish signals versus cable. Although why probably right now you don't have any service. So, but anyway, some of those kind of things. So, what in general? Maybe you could explain to the listeners a little bit about what is common property. I mean, we talk about this stuff all the time, but what is common property, and what's the restrictions generally on the use of common property by somebody, by an individual owner, and then and maybe the whole concept of limited common property and what that is and why it exists, and again what you can do with your limited common property.
Okay. Well, those are good basic questions or basic issues.
Yeah, it's Monday morning and it's raining, so I threw you a softball here this morning. So
No, because I think it's things that people probably have misperceptions about or misconceptions anyway.
Well, and the thing is, Peter, too, is that you're right, and we talk on the show about a lot of things. But a lot of times we forget that for a lot of people, some of the basics, like, just what is common property, what does that really mean, and why do I have it or why don't I have it, and what's the difference? A lot of people just really have never been exposed to that, so they really don't fully understand what they mean, what it means.
When I teach the board certification courses for condominium associations and for homeowner associations, because as most of our listeners probably know, that under the law, when you become a board member now, at least a year before or within 90 days of getting on a board, you must either sign a certificate that you've read the documents, you uphold them to the best of your ability, and you will conduct yourself in accordance with your fiduciary responsibility, to the owners, which is a paraphrase. Or you take a course from a certified provider like myself and many others, and you get certified that way, and you get a certificate. So anyway, but as part of that course, I do go through some what I would call the basics. What is a condominium versus what is an HOA, and we talk about common area versus common elements. Now, common elements, finally getting to your topic right after that rambling intro. For a condominium, the way to create that under the Florida law, Chapter 718, is the developer will record a declaration of condominium against a particular piece of property. And what that declaration of condominium does, among other things, is it subdivides the property, in essence. And it subdivides the property into units and common elements, with the units, obviously being the property that is going to be conveyed to the unit owners. And those units are defined usually by a description of parametrical boundaries of upper boundary, lower boundary, and parametrical, or I guess I'm going to call it side boundaries. And everything else, generally speaking, is a common element. So really, for a condominium, it really depends how the developer defines how he decides to define the unit boundaries. And the common elements, which is sometimes a misperception or misconception, are not owned by the association. In a condominium, the common elements are owned by the owners in shares. So the association typically in a condominium doesn't really own any real property, or very rarely. Sometimes they will be conveyed a tract of land, and that's known as association property. But the common element property is the property that's outside the unit boundaries. It can be anything from the roof, exterior walls of the building, roads, parking spaces, clubhouse, whatever the rest of the property is. And the common elements are maintained by the association, and the units can be maintained either way, depending on what the declaration says. Now, you also mentioned limited common element, right?
Right.
So a limited common element is still a common element. In other words, it's not part of the units. It's not owned by any owner. But a limited common element is a portion of the common elements that the Declaration of Condominium designates for the exclusive use of one or more units, but less than all the units. So, and that can be also a range of different things, depending again on how the developer is creating his project or her project. The typical limited common elements you'll see are balconies, terraces, although those balconies and terraces sometimes are made part of the unit too. So you have to read the documents to figure out, is the terrace or the balcony part of the unit, or is it part of the common elements or limited common elements? Other limited common elements typically that you see are parking spaces, storage areas or storage lockers. You'll see even wine storage lockers or wine storage areas being designated as a limited common element.
Ooh, could you give me the name of that association? Cause
the wine one.
Yes, I want to go there.
The staircases sometimes, or stairwells that serve a particular unit or units. Sometimes you'll see things like an elevator lobby or a lobby area that's either just used by a specific unit or maybe two units, may be designated as a limited common element. There's no real exact hard and fast rule. Depends upon how the developer, when he was creating the project, what he thought certain things should be designated as. Now, a limited common element, the documents can go either way as far as the maintenance. It could be maintained by the association as a common expense, as typically you see with parking spaces and balconies. It could be maintained by the owner at his or her expense, or it could be maintained by the association at the expense of the owners who have the right to use it. Again, depends upon how the Declaration of Condominium addresses the maintenance of the limited common element. So that's kind of a brief lesson on that. Homeowner associations, their term of art, rather than common element, is common area. In a homeowner association, the common area is typically deeded or owned by the association, unlike condominiums where the common elements are, like I mentioned before, are owned by the owners. Common area, typically is not always, but almost always, the common area are the portions of the property subject to the declaration, not included within the lots that are owned by the individual owners. Like I said, common area deeded to the association. I've also seen limited common area, where there's portions of the common area similar to a condo where the owners have the exclusive right. You don't see that as nearly as often, but you do see occasionally, where there'll be some limited common area that an owner has the exclusive use right of, even though they don't own it. Mm-hmm. So that's relatively briefly the difference between the two common area, common element scenarios.
Yeah, and I think it's it's important for the listeners to understand, or to people that own units. I shouldn't say listeners, but people that own units. Go ahead.
Yeah, one more thing. I didn't mean to interrupt you. You did say something about uses, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The use rights or restrictions on the use are typically set forth in your declaration of condominium or your declaration of covenants and restrictions, depending on which type of community we're talking about. In the common element context, the Condominium Act does say that the common elements, are to be, used by the owners for the purposes for which it's intended. Okay, so whatever those purposes may be. The association can also pass reasonable rules and regulations regarding the use, but those rules and regulations cannot conflict with your declaration, either express or anything inferred from your declaration. Sorry, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, that's good, and I wanted to, I guess my point there is that, so you can see that a lot of how kind of some of all of this fits together, so to speak. Typically, Peter talked about homeowners associations, and a lot of times there's common area, And that area is typically owned by the association, the homeowners association. In other words, the deed is in the name of the association. And so, from that standpoint, you've got a situation where uh, the so you would think that maybe that you would see those assets, those ownership interests on the books of the association. That the association, if you looked at the association's balance sheet, which shows all of their assets and liabilities, that you would see these assets, but typically they're not, and that's confusing to people. People say, well, if they own it, how come it's not on their books? And that is because in a homeowners association, the association doesn't typically have the right to sell those assets without the approval of the members. So therefore, the use of the assets really isn't theirs, it's the members. And the members have just, in effect, designated the association to take care of those assets, to manage them, to preserve them, to replace them, or to take care of replacing them for the unit owners. The unit owners are paying all of that. In a condo association, the deed actually will be, the deed actually lists your percentage of the common elements and, on your particular deed, and there's no ownership by the association in those assets. And so, so from that standpoint, what you got to keep in mind when people look at associations and say, well, what can I do? Oh, these guys are powerful, or what can or can't they do? Or even when you're a board member, what you can or can't do. You've got to remember that basically the association is really just an entity that's been set up to take care of, to handle and manage collectively everybody's interest. And so they're really acting on the behalf of the individual owners. The owners elect the board, and then the board appoints officers, and those officers manage the day-to-day business within the guidelines of what the board wants, and the board sets policy in accordance with what the homeowners want. And if the homeowners don't like what the board members do, they vote them out. The next time they can vote them out. And if the board members don't like what the officers are doing, they can kick them out pretty much at any time. So that whole fiduciary responsibility is significant, because first of all, it's not an ownership interest, so they're not their assets to spend and to change or to do whatever. They are only there to maintain in accordance with the documents. That's the job of the association. So when you go to the association and you start complaining to the association about, oh, you guys need to do this, or you need to do that, or even situations where you have a board where the board, certain people on the board want to do things. Even certain members of the board, a majority may want to do something. Well, it's important to keep in mind that they may not have, even though it may be something they want to do, they have a fiduciary responsibility to all of the members within the association. So even though there's some things that they may want to change or they may want to do, or maybe it's something that they think that they would want to handle, you got to keep in mind that they have a fiduciary responsibility. They may not, and they can't just do what they want to do. They have to do what they're required to do or what they need to do to protect all of the homeowners and to protect everybody according to the documents. But we have a call. Richard, go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure, no problem.
Hey, I live in a homeowners association, all single-family homes, and since the community's been developed in the early 2000s, there was a deal where the developer had cable, some arrangement with it was Comcast Cable at the time, and whatever they are now. That deal, and in the end, it was roughly $55 a month or so of our association dues went to servicing that arrangement to the tune of about $225,000 a year. Everybody was always suspicious that the developer obviously, was benefiting from that somehow. But all of that being said, he's long gone, and that deal expires, I should say, in September. So, and they didn't have enough voters to vote to reinstate it or to re-up it, I guess is the way to put it. And so the homeowners are all saying, okay, so our dues should now be $55 a month less because we don't have that $250,000 we're paying out on a yearly basis to Comcast Cable. At the most recent meeting, it was brought up, apparently, this whole arrangement, and the board of directors said that no, they're going to continue to collect that extra $50 or $55 a month from all of the homeowners to put in reserve for other potential items, i.e. maybe road paving and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, is that legal for them just to kind of continue to collect on an item that no longer exists as of September, and just say, hey, we're just going to open a savings account with the same money?
Okay.
You want to handle
Mark,
that one, Peter? Or
you want me to talk about that?
I'll take it first, and then you can clean up for me like you always do.
You want to deal with that first?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
And then you can clean up for me. Here's the thing, Richard. It's you mentioned it was under developer control. I know, a lot of times, and there's always concern about the contracts and kickbacks. Frankly, the kickback, and I put that in quotes, is that typically these companies like AT&T and Comcast will come in and to entice the developer to sign a long-term contract, they will typically give them some sort of rebate or some sort of a payment, contractual reduction in payment that goes to the association, but in effect it helps the developer because the developer, it covers expenses that the developer might have to pay. The second thing is most developers don't provide reserves, all right? Because the concept, although this didn't hold true during the crash, the concept is that a developer isn't going to be there long enough. Everything's already new. So the developer takes the position, I'm not funding reserves because I'm already giving you new stuff. It's your job to replace it. I bought it new, And so, but when these things drag out like this, what typically happens is that the board is going to now have to start assessing for reserves. They're going to have to do some sort of reserve assessment because they need to start putting money aside to replace the infrastructure. And so what your board is doing, obviously, is they're saying, okay, we're not extending our contract with Comcast or whatever, not entering into a new one, but we're going to take that money that was going to our operating fund to cover operating expenses, and we're going to push it into our reserve fund to cover reserve expenses. Now, if those are actual reserve accounts and they've established those reserve accounts, the members have established those reserve accounts, the board can't just do what they want with that money, typically. Now, again, I'm assuming that those are reserves that have been established by the association. So when you put that money in there, or when that money goes in there, they're going to tell you what reserve accounts they're going into, paving, like you said, or storm sewer or whatever. And then they're going to earmark that money, and then when it comes time to replace that, they've got hopefully enough money to do that. Again, what we were talking about a little bit before is that your board has a fiduciary responsibility to maintain the association. So the whole concept of doing that is that they provide a budget which shows how much money is necessary to run the association, the operating fund, and how much money needs to be set aside to replace the common area assets when they need to be replaced. And they designate those numbers. They don't technically have to go back to the members and say, do you want to do this? Because they have a responsibility to do it. Now, if they want to do something less than that, let's say they don't want to fund reserves, or they don't want to cover their operating expenses for some reason, then at that point, they can go back to the members and ask the members for a special assessment or to borrow money or to waive. They technically can't even not fund operating expenses. If you don't have enough money to cover your bills, the board has to fund that. They have to go out and raise that money one way or another, either through a special assessment, an increase in your budget or your operating expenses, or in some sort of borrowing, because they have a responsibility to not let the building fall apart and go into disrepair, or legally to have liens placed and things like that. So that's kind of in a nutshell the operating side of that. And you'll see that happen a lot. But normally what happens, and this is why people say, well, the developer, what was going on? Because all of a sudden when we turned over, everything goes up. We have all these. Well, that's because, A, the developers usually are managing their money and their costs because they're trying to sell units and they don't want it to be too expensive. But also they're not putting money aside for repairs. They're not putting any money aside to fix anything. And so as a result, down the road, the new board that comes in after the turnover usually has to cover some of that.
Well, to be clear, in this case, the developer the association's been turned over for 15 years. From the developer, it was just the original deal. This developer signed a long-term deal with Comcast, and so now that deal is expiring, people who are taking advantage of the basic cable that was provided to each homeowner through that deal, through that extra $55 a month in our dues, now they're going to have to pay their, whatever their monies to Comcast is of $55 a month, let's just say. And and we're obligated, I guess, to continue to pay the money that's in our dues that was designated for Comcast. And you're saying basically that the board can do that. They can just kind of continue to collect those monies if they're doing it responsibly.
Well, Mark, you done?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Basically, that's correct. I mean, there's nothing in the law that says that once a particular service or expenditure ceases, in this case the cable television contract, that the monies that were earmarked in the budget or were designated in the budget for that item must come out of the budget or must be returned to the owners or something like that. So the board generally has a fair amount of, I could use the word discretion, or to use their business judgment, which is actually the better term, to decide that, this association is now X amount of years old, we have assets that are aging, we should really, bump up our reserves or switch this money to reserves. And they generally, the board, absent something in the documents that would preclude them from doing that, they can do that because they're exercising their business judgment and saying, we think that, this community needs, X amount of dollars in the reserves. Now, Mark is right that in fact that since you're not a condominium, and it sounds like the reserves, I'm assuming, were not created day one by the developer, were not voted in by the owners. The board could at some point change its mind, or the next board could decide, that money is better off, not being put into reserves and the budget being reduced, or the money being used for something else. But long story short, to answer your question more specifically, there's nothing in the law that says that once that cable stops at the $55 must be subtracted from the budget necessarily. They can decide to move that money to something else that they feel is a legitimate need. And reserves, obviously, we can all disagree, but reserves for the most part are a legitimate association expense.
Richard,
so the answer is yes. So the answer is yes. They can do it. Now, if the overwhelming majority, or not overwhelming majority, but if the majority of owners think, that's not a good decision, then this board theoretically could get voted out. But that's a political issue.
Richard, it's funny. I know what you're dealing with, though, because I had the same thing. And this is funny, funny, not funny, haha, but funny, ironic, that this is coming up. And Comcast has got a major push right now to get associations to sign long-term contracts. They're throwing a lot of money at it because, in general, the cable industry is worried about the cable TV going away because it's been, I don't know how old you are, but it's being replaced by internet TV, Netflix and things like that. You don't need cable most times anymore. You could get by with all this other stuff. And so as a result, it's gotten to the point that the people don't need it. But you do need internet, and people were paying for that internet, and they were paying for those expenses, and now they still need internet, and the association has canceled that contract or not renewed that contract. And so if they don't get some of that money back, it costs them a lot of money. In other words, this $55 is money out of the pocket because the unit owner has to pay that expense still. They can't go without TV or without, I mean, they could, but most of them aren't. And we're getting a big struggle here in Florida right now among those people who are here for season, and then the unit's basically empty, and they don't want to pay for this stuff. So they say, the heck with it. I don't need it. I'm down here for season. I'm not down here to watch TV. So I don't care. I don't want a long-term contract, or I'll take a short-term contract or something basic. And so as a result, it's a big issue right now. And then to top that all off, you've got companies like AT&T that are maybe not as competitive on certain things, but are trying to be more are competitive on TV, maybe through DirecTV or Dish TV, whichever one they own, and through some of the other and through cell phone services. So now you're starting to see these places come in and they say, look, we'll give you internet, we'll give you Dish TV or DirecTV, and we'll give you a cell phone as a package if the association agrees to a contract. And so it's getting really complicated. And in the process, many of the associations and many of the boards are leaving out internet. And I think going forward, that's one of the things that if I was looking for a place to live right now, particularly in a condo, the one thing that I would look for is a building that had internet access, Wi-Fi internet access, that was within the building. To me, that's just a service nowadays that pretty much everybody's going to expect. So the internet access becomes a basic cost to the association, a basic utility, just like power. But anyway, it's interesting. It's a big struggle right now, and I've seen associations dump it, and then other people be really mad because their costs have gone up considerably because that base cost that Comcast was throwing in there for usually included internet and a certain amount of TV, and it was a discount. You were maybe saving $20 or $30 a month. Now you got to go out, sign something else, and pay a little more. I mean, some people that don't have that benefit, they're paying a couple $100 a month for a cable bill, whereas before they might have been down around $150 and then even that they weren't paying all of that. Some of that was being paid through the association. So anyway, that's kind of it's a good question because it's a topic now. It's an issue now that's coming up pretty heavily. I think it's probably the next one that's big is the reverse of that is we've seen some associations sign some 7 and 10-year contracts. I know Peter, association down in Broward County, and won't mention any names, but a big one. They have a umbrella organization that nobody really even knew existed because it had ceased to do anything. It didn't have any assets that was really managing. It didn't have any common area that it was really taking care of, and so nobody really cared about it. And all these individual buildings were individual associations, and they had all of their own boards and their own entertainment funds, and they were doing their own thing, right? And then I think it was Comcast. It came to them and offered the association, this master association that again most people didn't even really existed, a couple $1 million to sign a 10-year contract to lock up the whole association, which really caused some issues down there. First of all, the money didn't go to the individual associations. It's in this one, this one entity, and they had the ability to kind of spend it, and at the same time, they're locked up in a contract for 10 years. So, Peter, on that subject, I know there's been some changes back and forth. And Richard mentioned there was a developer that had signed the original contract, and it was a long-term contract. He kind of indicated, maybe 15 years, but that which would be pretty long. That sounds like 2. It was probably a 7 with a renewal or something. But anyway, what are the limitations on signing a contract like that? What ability does the association have to get out of a contract if the developer signed it, and or let's say it's turned over and the board signed it? What kind of flexibility does an association have to cancel a contract like a cable contract?
Well, it doesn't really have much choice with respect to a contract that is a post-transition contract. I mean, if a board after transition signs a contract, assuming that the contract is otherwise within the scope of the board's authority, and a cable contract would be, then the association will be, locked into that contract. The pre-transition contracts, depending on the type of contract, the association can generally cancel. I have to look at the exact nature of the, what it says, but a cable contract. But generally speaking, contracts for the maintenance and repair and things like that, and operation of the association, those can be for a condominium. Those can be terminated upon a 75% vote of the owners. The pre-turnover contracts. So the association does have some ability there.
75% vote of the owners?
Yeah, but
okay.
I don't know. I've never seen a cable one contract under that scenario.
I did know there was something a couple years ago, wasn't there, that they changed some laws about that relative to the developer, I thought, on cable contracts specifically, or maybe it was just proposed. I don't remember. I thought there was some discussion of that, of some changes to that in the area of cable.
Well, any cable contract can be terminated. Any cable contract at any time, if the owners at the next meeting following when it's signed, they can terminate it.
Okay.
Okay. That is in the law. But as far as the initial one, let's hang on a second. I don't. It's whether or not it would be considered. Again, I haven't seen one canceled post transition.
It's and I just mentioned it for the list. It's a lot of times associations will go in and they'll start eliminating these contracts, after turnover, because they'll just assume that the developer is, is trying to, screw them over or something. But I tell you what, a lot of times these developers, they've negotiated some pretty good contracts because they have a lot of buying power. And one of the things I was going to say is two things I was going to say is, one, look at those contracts because those contracts may be really good. If I'm a developer and I'm building homes all over South Florida and I'm putting in, 500 or 1,000 homes a year, I'd probably negotiated some pretty good contracts with some people for landscape, for mowing, tree trimming, and for maybe cable and all of those kind of things. Because I have a tremendous, and you as an association now don't have that buying power. So if you go in and cancel the existing contract, you may find that your cost goes up because of the fact that that you don't have that kind of buying. They don't care. They're not going to cut you that kind of deal. So keep that in mind, that sometimes the things the developers do aren't all bad. They're in there, yes, to sell homes, But at the same time, part of the way they do that is to keep the assessments down and that type of thing. So as a result, they may have negotiated a pretty good contract. The other thing that I would say is that most times the developers have an attorney negotiate those contracts. And even after the fact, we're talking about a Comcast contract here that could be over a period of 5 to 10 years, could be millions of dollars. So don't try to do that on your own. Those are the kind of contracts, when we talk about that, we say, okay, some things maybe you don't need to get an attorney to look at all this stuff. But when you're talking about a multi-million-dollar cable contract, you want to bring your attorney in at that point and have them look that contract over. And it's a good idea to have an attorney look them over that knows, something about all of this. I guarantee you that the attorneys that are working for the cable companies, they have done thousands of these. So they know exactly what they're trying to get out of it. And they know exactly what they want in the contract. So you better make sure that your attorney, or that you have an attorney, first of all, and second of all, that your attorney, has done some of these before, because and been involved, because these are big deals. They could lock the association in for a long time. And think about it a minute. And that's why this is such a big issue right now. Let's say 5 years from now, there is no cable TV. You still got to pay that contract. I mean, they're still probably providing it, but nobody may be looking at it. People may be on internet TV and maybe on Netflix and all of those kind of things. And they don't care about the cable anymore. They don't want the cable anymore. All they want is internet. And frankly, they may already have internet through another source. They may have internet through their wireless phone. There's all kinds of ways they may already have internet, that they may not even care about a cable contract. It may be that there's in the next 2 years, 3 years, there's another company coming in offering really high-speed internet services and allows you to do streaming video and, gaming and all of the kind of things that a lot of people want nowadays, especially the movie streaming and all of that. So you may have, as an association, locked your homeowners into a contract to make a payment that's really kind of worthless. And if there's no way to get out of that, at least there's nothing you can do. At least your attorney is going to make sure that there's certain aspects of the contract that have to be maintained. Speeds, probably, on internet services, and that there's service levels that have to be met, and that if they don't meet those service levels, that you have an option of getting out of the contract and not having to pay a penalty. They're also going to look for escape clauses. They're going to try to put an escape clause in there for you, that even if there's no service issue, that you have some way to get out of it if you need to, and something to change. So that's the kind of thing that when you're looking at these things, you got to look at some of these contracts. And I know, you get people say, well, it's a TV contract, I can negotiate that. Well, you probably can't on these things. These things are pretty involved. And it's and they're spending a lot of money on the other end, making sure you're locked up. And right now, I can tell you that Comcast in particular, AT&T to some degree, they're locking people into these contracts.
All the contracts now are. I was just looking at one over the weekend. Okay, spent most of the weekend on it actually. They're all 10 years now.
Yeah.
Either because they're rewiring the property with fiber optics, which is a pretty big investment
deal.
for the company, or they're paying you for the 10 years. Like you said, they're giving you some type of bonus or compensation as consideration for the long-term contract. So that's what most of the contracts are. And the statute does say you can terminate a contract entered into before the transition if the contract is for the operation or maintenance of the association, operation, maintenance, or management. But that's a post-transition, or after you sign a contract, no matter when you sign it, the owners at the next members' meeting can vote to cancel it. I've never seen it happen. The owners do have it right. I just haven't seen the owners actually do that.
What
theoretically they can.
Along those lines, we're talking about developers. I know a lot of people, get a little concerned about, what happens with developers and all of that. They assume that there's, that there's some kind of kickback, or, and I will tell you the dirty secret to some degree in this industry is that there's a lot of that goes on. So people aren't being paranoid. That isn't somebody that's sitting under a foil triangle or something. That's. That some of that stuff goes on. There are all kinds of little things that happen in this industry that shouldn't, and it's hard to nail those down. But there's a lot of transactions where somebody is getting a benefit, and sometimes they don't know that they're doing something wrong, but other times they do, and it's illegal, but again, a lot of people don't realize. For example, you got a property management company. You're dealing with if you're a good property manager, you have some of the best contractors that you're using in the area. There are people who have great reputations, stand by their work, and who are available to you and your associations. And you've got a number of associations you're using them on. So the contractor's happy. They've got a lot of work. You're going to keep them busy. You're happy because you got locked up one of the best contractors in the area, and you don't have to worry about it. But how many times let's say I'm a property manager, and I want to have my house painted or my lawn cut or trees removed or whatever. Well, I'm going to call the people that I'm using most times because of the fact that they're the best there are at it. Now, if I'm reputable, I'm going to pay those guys. I want to pay those guys. But I will tell you that there are a lot of times that contractor will say, well, look, I'll give you a discount, no big deal, I'll charge you half, or whatever. Well, that's a kickback. That's illegal. You're not supposed to do that kind of stuff. So it's tough because of all this stuff that goes on in this industry. Most of it occurs on the maintenance side. It's not, when people worry about fraud in associations, they're thinking about people stealing cash. And that's what we hear about. We hear about people stealing money out of the reserves or whatever. But the fraud that occurs in the condo and HOA world is largely the fraud that I just mentioned. It's the kind of thing where somebody does work for the person on the side at a reduced price. They plant trees for them or cut their trees, or
an improper benefit.
Yep, an improper benefit
is what you're getting.
Right, and that's that's as much fraud as somebody that dips in and takes $10,000 out of the till, because
they can't paint the president's unit for nothing at the same time they're painting the hallways.
Right.
Or something like that.
Right. And the concept will be, well, I'm already there. I got my guys on, and, you're going to use the same paint, so no big deal. Well, that may be, but you still got to pay the price, And
right.
And here's the reason why. That contractor has to make up that someplace. They're not just going to eat it. So they're going to spread it among the rest of the jobs that they're getting paid on. Well, who are those jobs? Those are the jobs that you're managing, or that, that's your association. So your association painting was just a little bit higher because you got your house painted for free. So those are the kind of things, they're very tough to find. As an auditor, you can't find those things. They're almost impossible to determine what's going on there and catch them. And of course, the contractor's not going to admit to it. So it's one of those. So those are some of the things that we always deal with in the industry. It's a little bit different. So there is a reason to be a little bit concerned. But the flip side of that is that not all these contracts are like that. I mean, sometimes there's a benefit to that. Like I said, the developer that's doing 4 projects, and he's gotten the contractor to cut him a deal for his 4 projects. Now, that's kind of the same thing, but it's not illegal. It's because it's for the association. But he's gotten you a good deal. So sometimes you may want to look at those things, and like I said, get your attorney, on these contracts. Get them in to look at these things, look and see what's going on, and don't always just jump to the fact that, well, whatever we've got's got to be bad because the developer did it. May not be the case. It may be a real good deal, and you may want to hold the contractor to it, because you might get a couple, 2-3 years more of service for a reduced price. So anyway, that's just something to take a look at. We're almost running out of time, but we'll be back again next Monday from 9 to 10 o'clock. Tell your friends about it. We're streaming live on WSTU 1450, WSTU1450.com. So join us every Monday from 9 to 10 o'clock right here on WSTU Digital 1450. We're Martin County's Heritage Station.